Good morning, everybody. We're so glad that you're able to join us this morning for our annual Kristallnacht program. This program is being co-sponsored by Congregation Eitz Chaim at Howells Hills Bayside, Congregation Lador Vador, Fresh Meadows Jewish Center, and Temple Torah. I want to acknowledge my colleagues who have made this possible: Rabbi Wise, Rabbi Yaffe, Rabbi Ropi, and Rabbi Shifrin. And without the help and guidance of our Yom HaShoah committee, we would not be here. So thank you all. This morning, I'm happy to introduce Matt Lebovic. And if I pause a little bit, it's because I'm admitting people into our program. Matt is the director of the StandWithUs Holocaust Educaation Center. In that capacity, he works to educate schools around North America about the genocide, including the ongoing memory work that ranges from gathering testimony to excavating at site of former killing centers. Since 2012, Matt has been a Holocaust correspondent for the Times of Israel, having published nearly 300 articles. His topic today is Kristanacht. He's going to unpack the events of that terrible event, including how the so-called Reich pogrom was the tipping point to genocide. He's going to be looking at mainstream media at that time and what lessons it teaches us as we face growing anti-Semitism in our midst. So I'm very happy to welcome Matt. Thank you for coming, and the program is yours.
Thank you, Rabbi Green, for having me. And I'm also excited to welcome, from 3 hours away, time difference in Los Angeles, my associate director, Dr. Neely Alon Amit. And I will say to everyone here, I'm happy to see dozens of people here, either Neely and myself, we are available to teach at the schools, of your grandchildren or nephews. We want to come and teach about the Holocaust. We could do it on Zoom. We could do it on person. We do it interdisciplinary. So we are a new center at Stand With Us, the Holocaust Education Center. I know a lot of you know Stand With Us from our extensive pro-Israel work for 20 years. Last year, we did add a Holocaust Education Center due to the incredibly, frankly, horrible times we've been experiencing in the past couple of years. So that's kind of the context of who I am and Stand With Us and what this center is. And we're going to, have a presentation about Kristallnacht, like the rabbi said. Feel free if you want to type in a comment in the chats. I'm usually pretty good at presenting, and I could read comments or questions at the same time, or we'll make time at the end, that kind of thing. I'm not kind of good at seeing the hand raised, that kind of thing, but we'll figure it out. So as we've mentioned, we're looking at Kristallnacht today. And as the rabbi did in the write-up, we spoke a couple of weeks ago and had a lengthy conversation about how we could have a presentation that's new and different and relative, making use of new historical findings, for your group, because I know everyone here does not need a one-on-one level kind of introduction to what Kristallnacht was. So we're looking at, I would say, the echoes, the ramifications of the Night of Broken Glass in today's presentation. And really the reaction, how did President Roosevelt react? How did the media react? We will look at very new findings. Some of you I know are aware, because you're very interested in the Holocaust like I am. Just 4 days ago, new photos from Kristallnacht were distributed and released by the Associated Press. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which you've all probably been to or at least know about, they're doing new studies and new testimonies. We're going to look a little bit at American Jews and Rabbi Stephen Wise and the idea of keeping quiet. That's of course a whole presentation of itself, and I'll recommend some books on that for you if you want to learn more. And then finally, we want this to be relevant to you all today. So how can we connect this Kristallnacht media coverage even to what's going on campus today. So I really kind of scratched my brains last night trying to think about it, but it was really obvious. So this is really quite relevant, and what we could all do about this today in terms of the same coverage. Now, this photo here, usually I explain the photo before the slide. This shows you Kristallnacht. It wasn't one night of broken glass. It was also a morning of Germans gathering around the smoldering synagogues in a carnival-like atmosphere, taking lots of photos, and it lasting well into the next day. So there's actually hundreds of photos like this one in the background. When I teach Kristallnacht to students, which is the main purpose of our center, we've really been trying to emphasize that it's a tipping point or a turning point to the Holocaust itself. It's not something that you would want to look at separately. And in this photo, you see, I think it's German children, in the ruins of one of the synagogues, that has been attacked on Kristallnacht. Now, again, with this group, I know I don't need to begin it all from scratch. Sometimes I do have to begin. Who are the Jewish people? Where did the Jewish people live 2,000 years ago? When I'm talking to a public school of non-Jews. So obviously I'm not gonna do that today, but I just wanna give a little bit for a couple of minutes of some of the important things we do point out in terms of how we teach this content to students. Early on in the Nazi reign, there was Aryanization. And Hitler really took over the legal field by appointing only Nazi judges, as you see in the photo, the universities, all of these exclusions. And a lot of historians, and even in sort of Hollywood, like when Ken Burns made the new documentary about the US and the Holocaust, they have taken to comparing the Nuremberg laws and a lot of those actions to the Jim Crow laws. Because as you all know, in this country, a lot of people are talking about things like the Jim Crow laws and these legacies. So it's kind of an easy analogy for students to understand what was happening to the Jews in terms of segregation, exclusion, persecution. The Nuremberg race laws, I think those we really haven't changed how we explain those. They were really two things. It was one, take away rights of citizenship. There were actually 1,000 different ordinances in the Nuremberg race laws for the Jews, 1,000. But the other thing about them, as a lot of you know, rather wickedly, they were used to determine who is a Jew in terms of someone's bloodline, how many grandparents they have. And of course, we also explore, you can't teach people, young children who aren't Jewish about the Holocaust, you can't teach that without exposing them to some of the propaganda and explaining the hateful messages. The two keywords that we always use, dehumanization. When you say someone is a parasite spreading typhus, like you see at the left, that's dehumanizing someone. And then, of course, demonization. When you say someone is the wire puller of all of the Western societies, and behind every communist is a Jew, and all of these other things, you're demonizing the Jews. This is something I hadn't really focused on until rather recently, coming across photos, but I find that the students at the schools we teach at can relate to this. In the Der Stürmer weekly Nazi newsletter, they posted it in very public places under, these bulletin boards. As you see via my blue arrows, the bulletin boards were permanently decorated to say that Jews are horrible. But every week you would go and you would see the new issue, you'd get the new cartoons, you'd be given the new messages. And I was comparing this to some students. I was just in Canada for the week teaching at schools in Canada, so I'll probably weave that in a couple of times for you. But this is kind of like the Twitter feed or social media. And you don't even have to have a smartphone or access to anything, because if you're a German kid, these bulletin boards were all over the country. So the regime was able to reach every single kid.
I didn't know that.
Okay, now here's another example. There's dozens of these photos. I'm only going to show you 2 or 3, but I'm putting these blue arrows to point out to you that the Jews are our misfortune. All kinds of messages about the Jews are the permanent feature of the bulletin board. As a lot of you know, 1938 was an incredibly pivotal year. The world really let Hitler do everything he wanted with annexing Austria, perpetrating Kristallnacht. This was the year of a green light to Hitler, that he could do what he wanted. Entire books have been written about this topic, but here we have a typical scene in Nazi Germany with torches. Now, even before Kristallnacht, as a lot of you know, earlier in the year, some incredibly important conferences were held, such as at Evian, because the Jews wanted to escape Nazi Germany, but the quotas of the countries were very low. So these were appalling things that went on in history, because at Evian, for example, none of the countries agreed. 36 countries would not admit any new refugees. And you had a country like Australia saying that we do not have a racial problem now, we are not desirous of importing a racial problem. So the countries of the world are really clear. We do not want Jews, even though they're desperately fleeing, fleeing Nazi Germany. The same thing with the cartoon on the right. A lot of editorial cartoons, and the world fully recognizing that no one's letting in Jews as Hitler's threatening to kill them. On the eve of Kristallnacht, eve meaning, I think, 2 weeks before, something precipitated it in that Hitler felt very emboldened. And this is the first really large-scale action, kind of leading into the Holocaust. He rounded up in Germany were all of the Jews who had been born in Poland. So they weren't German citizens yet. There were about 17,000 Jews in Germany who, again, had Polish citizenship. And the Gestapo rounded them up and sent them all to the border of Germany and Poland refused to let them in. And for weeks, this massive group, languished kind of in the open air without supplies, while Germany wouldn't let them back in. Poland, wouldn't let them in. These are some photos of, from that. It's called the Polish Action. And one of the people watching this is a young man in Paris, France, a student named Herschel Greenspan. He's watching this in the media because his own parents and sibling are among these refugees. So Herschel Greenspan, a lot of you probably know that name already. He took matters into his own hand in Paris with a gun, and he went into a German diplomat's office, assassinated the German diplomat. In his pocket, he had a note saying, "This is revenge for what you're doing to all these Jews at the border. The world needs to know about it." And because Herschel Greenspan did this, it was a really great pretext for Goebbels, the propaganda minister, and Hitler to unleash what they had already been planning and building toward, to unleash a tremendous pogrom, on the Jews, the likes of which had not been seen since the Middle Ages. This was only the pretext or the catalyst for them to unleash that. Now, in addition to the murders, of course, that took place that night, there were hundreds of suicides, something not talked about for many decades, because many people, their husband or son or uncle, whatever, was taken to a concentration camp. 30,000 young Jewish men were taken to camps. And remember, the population of Jews in Germany is rather small. So that's a huge portion of the young Jewish men. The destruction of synagogues, people are familiar with, the homes, the businesses. Jews were fined, of course. The Jewish community had to pay for the destruction inflicted on it. And as usual, the regime had very close control over how things were depicted. So there's almost no film footage at all of Kristallnacht. And the photos that we have of it, they really only came out after the war because they were very good about suppressing it. When Goebbels met with his cronies the night before Kristallnacht, he said, tell all the brown shirts and all the cronies who were going to perpetrate this not to wear their uniforms, dress in street clothes, don't wear your party or your militant uniforms. We don't want to be blamed. And, with the spray paint, write the words "Revenge for Vom Rath." Vom Rath is the name of the German diplomat killed by Herschel Greenspan in Paris the day before. So I looked hard. I couldn't really find much in terms of anyone writing "Revenge for Vom Rath," but they made these assiduous efforts to have it look like a spontaneous night of people's indignation. That's what Goebbels actually wrote in his diary. We will call this the night of the people's indignation. There's yet another photo of the casual, well-dressed, people watching a synagogue smoldering well into the next day. And now I mentioned the 30,000 young Jewish men brought to three camps at that point: Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen. Until this point, really, those concentration camps were for political dissidents. This is the first time you see Jews rounded up en masse and sent to those concentration camps. So you're really leading into the Holocaust. And of those 30,000, at least 2,500 never made it home from the camps. So it's when I teach Kristallnacht, to students, we really want to expand their understanding a little bit more than Night of Broken Glass, and explain, the aftermath and the connections of the weeks and months after it, and why that relates to the bigger picture. Certainly not to present in isolation what happened in one night. A lot of what happened in the weeks ahead was public humiliation. This photo I used in one of my articles for the Times of Israel last year, and I got a lot of emails from historians and people asking me where I found it. I don't really have any magic. I use Google Images, and the only thing I do is I scroll much farther than most people are willing to try to find these photos. I don't have a key to an archive or anything. It's all out there if you spend time looking. But the reason, I'm not surprised this photo resonated with readers and even historians, because look at the expression on the woman's face. What's going on here, you can't see no matter how much you zoom in, but they're wearing signs that say on them, "I am not part of the national community." And they're, the people are kind of at a, I don't know, carnival atmosphere. That guy in the back, he looks like he might be slapping or cutting the hair of the woman in the middle. You kind of see these ghost-like figures hanging out of the windows. I think it's a very evocative photo. And one thing that Neely, my associate director, and myself, we really think it's important to teach the Holocaust through sort of visual media, creative expression. And you won't, you're not going to find any slides where we just sort of list, 5 things and expect students to pay attention. Students need to be engaged, and photos are a really good way to do it, because you could start talking about the word bystander. What's a bystander? The word perpetrator, all these things, introduce it organically. The days of humiliation included, grotesque parading around of people. I think the star that these men are wearing says something about their God not being the real God. And so I'm only showing you 2 or 3 of these photos, but there's dozens of photos of, this aftermath of the public humiliation. And of course, this strange double-edged sword, where the Jews of Germany and Austria, they really do all want to leave now, the ones who hadn't left already, but the Nazis are making it very hard, completely liquidating everything they own. In this case, the Nazis are actually blocking off the, one of the offices. I think it's Vienna. I just noticed right now, every time I see new things, look at the smirk and the grin on the Nazi all the way at the left. The guy at the left who's linking arms, he has a really wide grin on. And they're gonna block these Jews from getting the paperwork they need to escape, yet at the same time they're being told, get out. So this is a very harrowing photo, even though of course it's not violent directly. So speaking of photos, you can get students engaged in picking things apart. When I introduce Nazism, you can show photos of the book burnings and explain why books were burned. And you could mention that, and there was a philosopher in the 19th century who said, wherever books are burned, man will eventually be burned. This photo, when I first came across it, I thought it was a book burning, but then, I sort of saw its daylight. The book burnings are always at night. This photo is actually even more scary than a book burning, because I forget what town it is, apologies, but the people in the town ran into the synagogue and they took everything in the synagogue, the Torahs, the talisim, every ritual object. They're now gathered around watching as the synagogue's holy property burns in the middle of town. In broad daylight. So like I said, to me, in some ways, this is more disturbing and scary and evocative than those early book burning photos that we see hundreds of, kind of films of, and we've all seen that a lot. Only now, our presentations here at Stand With Us, we're never off the shelf. When I was just in Canada, I spent each night updating, changing the presentation based on what school I was going to. So 4 days ago, the Associated Press did release some new photos from Kristallnacht that came to the museum's attention in DC by way of some kind of donation. Often people pass away and some kind of descendant will give the museum these photos. 1 year ago, someone gave the museum something called the Sobibor Perpetrator album, which was absolutely incredible, because for the first time we have photos of the inside of the Sobibor death camp. So something like that, happened 4 days ago. It probably happened months ago, but you know how PR is. You want to hold and get news stories. So they released photos, and they're photos that no one has ever seen before. The holy books being removed from a synagogue, of some, a German breaking the glass, And again, like I indicated earlier, the Nazis were really careful, like not having people film this. Photographers were kicked out, not to have evidence. So some of these photos are pretty rare. There's not a lot of photos of it actually taking place. They're mostly from the next morning. Desecrating a sanctuary in a synagogue. This is a very rare photo. I don't think there's any prior to the other day, this coming out. I don't think there's any photos like this. Now, when I was looking for the revenge for Vom Rath, I was trying to see, did anyone actually spray paint that anywhere? I found this photo. This is just a couple of days ago, and I thought it was interesting because it's very evocative. Clearly the Aron Kodesh, elements are, piled up here. It looks like a garage sale, but only this morning, when I woke up and obviously wanted to run through the presentation, so I sound cognizant, did I notice that it actually does involve Von Rath. It wasn't just there on my Google Images by coincidence. There, in fact, is a sign light as day saying it's revenge for Von Rath. So that's really the only example I can find of someone saying that. And this is a photo I'll definitely be using in the future because I had never seen it, and I think it's very evocative. The only reason it was called Kristallnacht, some of you might know this, is because in Berlin the next morning, the Berliners were a bit appalled at the waste of glass. They were very, thinking it was very wasteful in hard economic times. That's so much glass. I believe most of the glass in Germany came from Belgium, and I read some statistic that it took 2 years of the entire Belgian glass industry to replace the glass shattered all over the Reich that night. Because remember, it wasn't just Germany, it was Austria, part of Czechoslovakia. So the Berliners, where Hitler was never popular, because Berlin was, of course, liberal and progressive before Hitler. Hitler was, his base was firmly in Bavaria in the south. The Berliners, they kind of, I'm not saying they liked Jews at all or had sympathy for Jews, but they did walk around thumbing their nose and calling it the Reich Kristallnacht, kind of like the shattered crystals on the street. So it was kind of a mocking name that the Berliners gave, and that's what stuck, for better or worse, all of us in our synagogues and historians. And as I said earlier, the Goebbels, he wanted it to be called the Night of the People's Indignation. That definitely didn't stick. And the Kristallnacht, needless to say, it was messy and inefficient. It was public. So this is not, as you know, when you talk about the Holocaust, the Germans were, they're really typified by their efficiency and their secretiveness. So that, there were kind of a lot of conclusions to be drawn from Kristallnacht. Go down 1 second. Sorry. Okay. And one of the conclusions was, pogroms are emotional. Other people had commented, pogroms are messy, they're emotional, they're not an effective way to channel the people's rage. So the Germans they were kind of joking, but they're like, if Kristallnacht was the illegal pogrom, we will now have the legal pogrom. And all that means is for the following months after that night, the courts, the judges, they just instituted all these laws to totally despoil and force out any Jews who were left. That's what's meant by the legal pogrom. But here's an image of a house being ransacked. And again, it's just catch-22 where everyone's desperate to leave. They're willing to give up their possessions, but there's no countries that will let them in. In recent years, a lot of people bring up Anne Frank. Otto Frank, her father, he applied for American visas. So she's one of these people who, if the quotas had been fulfilled, I mean, the existing quotas in the US weren't fulfilled, someone like Anne Frank and her family could have come in. How did the media report on this? The media reported on Kristallnacht immediately. And in this case of the New York Times, really rather accurately, because as I told you, they wanted it to look spontaneous, but this headline is like amazingly accurate because it says that it went on until Goebbels calls a halt. So I don't know whether they intended to or not, but the New York Times knew exactly what took place. And another thing on the right, you see I pulled a quote from another newspaper, the LA Examiner. That's kind of even more an important quote because it's yet another example of Hitler and Germany channeling to the world what's going to happen to Jews. They're literally saying, you democracies better take them in because under the cover of war, we will wipe them out. Hitler's constantly saying this in the months leading up to the Holocaust, but it's constantly being minimized, ignored. Hitler's a clown. Hitler won't conquer countries and be able to do this. Of course not. So more media coverage from Dayton, Ohio, the heart of America, anti-Jewish rioting sweeps Germany. Even photos, this is just 2 days later, photos made it in, which is remarkable because the Nazis arrested a lot of photographers. And as you all know, it's not like a photographer could just email in his photos that night. So, to have these appear in the Manchester Guardian 2 days later is kind of remarkable. Nazi mobs loot, burn, murder. This is an extremely accurate headline. I don't think it's biased. I don't think, Camera or any of these organizations would have a problem with it if you're familiar with Camera. This is another example of the Western media really showing the truth behind it. The headline, I put the arrow, the gangs are unhampered by the police. So it's clearly a pogrom. The main core of a pogrom is that the government or the police are involved. They're turning a blind eye. They're supplying weapons, whatever. The second headline, photographer arrested. Oops, go too fast. So, here's the actual newspaper where I read that headline. Hitler clearly saying a genocide is coming. And now President Roosevelt, I had to research this again last night. It gets, every time I dig deeper into what actually happened and what historians are finding with President Roosevelt, it does become a bit more troubling. He waited to make a comment. First of all, he didn't report on Kristallnacht the day after, like the media did. And he waited a few days. And then when he did issue a comment, strangely, he didn't mention Jews at all. He just said it was, disturbing. And he says he himself couldn't believe that happened in a civilized, but there's no mention at all of any victims, any Jews or anti-Semitism or Hebrew, nothing whatsoever. So completely, he is completely not wanting to look at all like the US would ever be, going to war or getting mad at Germany for something involving Jews. So it's very strange. And again, this is one of these topics where it's outside of the scope of today's presentation, but many books have been written about, the American Jewish response. I do recommend Raphael Madoff's books. I've written a few articles about them. And just, Rabbi Stephen Wise, he was a rabbi. I don't think we have a rabbi like him today where every American Jew can point to him. Now he merged, liberalism and Judaism, so to speak. So I'm not saying that Rabbi Wise was popular with everyone. That's not what I'm trying to, but he was a household name. And for better or worse, as a friend of Roosevelt, he did represent, the American Jews during the Holocaust. So there's several books written about, what he did. The main thing, my main takeaway, frankly, from the books is that he really told the Jews to be quiet and, don't ruffle feathers, don't take to the streets. We don't want Americans thinking we're fighting the war to rescue Jews. There was fear mongering that a pogrom will take place in America if Jews do try to protest the killings of Jews. So it's another kind of example, where the more I dig in here, I get a little more disturbed. But I'm sure there's another side as well. Certainly, I'm not trying to be partisan for anyone. Overall, the coverage of Kristallnacht, there was a lack of context and connection. Now, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum a few years ago started collecting the actual coverage, as you see here. And so it's kind of a fascinating infographic graphic because you see there's a headline on the cover of the newspaper, but there's actually very little content about what happened or its context. It's really like 4 paragraphs afterwards. And this is another interesting example. Granted, it's not from Kristallnacht, it's from after the Nuremberg laws, but this is indicative of the American media. This is everywhere. You have this thing where they'll put it as a headline, they'll put what happened as a headline, but then there won't be any, context or information on, on the rest of the page. There were obviously some movement and some protests. There was a lot of action from people in Hollywood. Something called the Bergson Group. I know a lot of you have heard of. There was a pageant staged, "We Shall Never Die." Certainly, people gave money to the JDC. Most notoriously, well into the Holocaust in 1943, when rabbis did go to Washington, FDR was in the White House, but he told them he can't meet with them. So he wouldn't even meet with the rabbis to hear their concerns. And, the community got more active and even the media started putting it on the front page. The only problem was the Holocaust was mostly over by the time, people started to protest, and on the front page, but 80% of the victims had been killed already. So, and in the United States, as in other countries, people held a very unfavorable view of Germany, but they also were, again, against admitting any more Jews than the quota allowed. The only bright spot really in the next year, I think, was the kinder transport, where the kids were taken to British families. But when I mention the kinder transport, which I know you all know about, when I mention it to kids today, to youth who don't know anything about it, you just have to take that number and put it against the 1.5 million Jewish children who were murdered, 1.5 million. So I think you can do both. I think you could, celebrate the upstanders who took these kids in for whatever reason. Some of them, granted, became Christian and lost their Jewish identity, but we can celebrate upstanders for rescuing, and we can also be more nuanced and the context of the 1.5 million against how many Europe was willing to actually save. Another topic, the books and movies have been written about this, but explaining the St. Louis journey to students is very good, because you get in Roosevelt in the US not letting these refugees in, but also Canada, and the fact that they had to go back to Europe, where 1/4 of them died in the Holocaust. So that's, when you tell students that this boat was off the coast of Miami, looking at the lights of Miami, everyone knows what that means. And yet these people have to go all the way back where some will die. And you show them a few photos of it, students find that interesting. And historians, they mostly say these days, and it makes sense, that Kristallnacht, it was a crescendo and a prelude. Crescendo, obviously, for my music fans, things really built up, toward this, high pitch crescendo. But it was also the prelude, because we didn't have the Holocaust yet. This is, previewing, and also it's, teaching Hitler lessons on what to do with the Holocaust. So I just made this slide last night. I really, based on the Rabbi Green's in my talk, I really wanted to put my head and think how, so we're commenting on the Kristallnacht media coverage. What is the connection to what's going on today? Like, what bridge can we make? And it didn't really take me that long, frankly, because disturbingly, I found it rather easy to think of 5 or 6 examples, but, there's a minimization of events. Sort of, for example, the newspapers that ran things about the broken glass, but never commented on the murders or the 30,000 people sent to camps or the suicides, etc. Not, the notion of not giving context. I just showed you examples from the Holocaust Museum where they've taken the covers of newspapers and proved that a lot of times it was only isolated headlines reporting on these things, and readers were never given a narrative. And so for the Holocaust, the dots weren't really connected by the major media, until I think the end of 1942. So this idea that a lot of anti-Semitism is kind of hidden from view, I kind of think that's similar too. Today we see in academia, for example, a lot of anti-Semitism against professors trying to get tenure who are Jewish, anti-Zionism, that kind of thing. That I think that's a bit similar to Kristallnacht in terms of trying to have people deceived about its origins. Now, when I wrote lumping together victim groups, I was thinking of FDR. I was definitely thinking of FDR and the note I showed you, because there's, as you all know, there's still a lot of times where Jews are just being lumped together, and the Holocaust was 11 million victims, and all these fields that were just being lumped together or discriminated against and that are taking place. And then diverting attention, why is Northeastern University student government passing a BDS motion against Israel? Like, this absurd persecution of only one country by, these bodies that have nothing to do whatsoever with international affairs. That, to me, that's also reminiscent of the media coverage of Kristallnacht. Now, the image here, I've heard this from a lot of people, including my own grandmother's testimony. I think I heard this when I was a little boy, but it was the idea that there were signs around town, Jews go to Palestine, in graffiti. Again, I've heard this a lot from different places in Europe, but of course they couldn't get in there because the British were blocking it. And now, as I know a lot of you are already thinking, because you're my Zionist-friendly audience, now we have Jews out of Palestine. Now, I myself, when I was a younger man in college, I remember going to Italy and randomly seeing, Jews out of Palestine. So there's really no win. There's really no win. I don't need to explain the irony of this to anyone. And I think, like I said, the rabbi and I discussed action steps and what's relevant. Like if I'm saying the media's coverage is similar, we at Stand With Us are very, very working hard, sorry for my grammar, to pass the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, because that includes anti-Zionism. And as I know you all know, when we look at our college campuses, our students are afraid to walk into Hillel. They're afraid to put out a table to promote for Birthright Israel. They're afraid to wear a Magen David. So we want universities and towns and states and governments to pass the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And that's one of the biggest things Stand With Us has been doing for the past few years. And a lot of it is frankly behind the scenes in terms of moving the dial on that. For everyone here, how can we all, what bodies I'm not an expert on this, I won't claim to be, but what governing bodies in New York State, or Long Island, how can we pass this definition and get people to agree to it so we can protect Israel in the process? So, so people can't claim, oh yeah, but I hate Israel, but that's not anti-Semitism. I have a Jewish friend. It's just Israel's a demon. So we want to end that. Then there's the whole world of academia. Another thing Stand With Us is heavily involved in that we don't talk about a lot is ethnic studies and critical race theory. These things were only active on the West Coast for a while, but now I can no longer really say that because we see these curriculums coming in and how Jews in Israel are treated in them, also on the East Coast and everywhere now. So we're involved in that. The third thing is for you all, the third thing is a really easy, important, very important way to get involved, straightforward, which is just sending in the emails to the editor or the letters to the editor, when they make these mistakes, when they're not accurate, all these horrible things, holding them accountable. Because as we saw with Adidas and Kanye West, as you see with apologies, sometimes issued by the New York Times, if they get a lot of emails and a lot of people, they do the action, they do it. So every email obviously counts, just like voting. Now, our model at Stand With Us is very good because we're very organic. We have interns in the high schools and college campuses. They're called fellows, and they're the ones who invite people like me in to give the talk, like in an organic way, whether it's a school-wide assembly or a genocide class. So, supporting organizations like Stand With Us and other organizations that are on the ground with young people, fighting for Israel, pushing back against anti-Semitism, that's an extremely powerful way. And all the 10 schools I went to in Canada this week, I was hosted by our interns. And in some cases, I was speaking to 200 students who had never had good Holocaust education. Number 5, I know a lot of you do this already, but just, using your own platforms, especially if you have, friends who don't support Israel or non-Jewish friends, advocating, speaking out. And really number six is one that I've felt about for many years is important, but only I think in the past few years is the Jewish community connecting the dots, which is we need more Holocaust education and awareness, not less. A few years ago, a lot of people were publishing books, sort of denigrating Holocaust memory and saying it's overkill. What is his name? Avram Berg. He was a Knesset speaker, Avram Berg. I'm blanking on the name of his book, but these books were coming out basically saying we're psychologically obsessed with the Holocaust, the Holocaust, and it's like somehow messed up the Jewish people. And I want to write to Avram Berg and send him back his own book because the situation now is appalling. The lack of awareness, even among Jewish students, is appalling. So the premises, and again, I apologize, Avram Berg, I don't remember the name of his book, but, and I'm going off on a rant, but Holocaust education as an action step, to protect us. So that is the sum of my, main presentation. I'd really like to hear not only, questions and comments, but I know a lot of you have things to add because you're all very interested in this topic. And both Neely and myself, we really like to hear what people have to add about their story. So, we could know those and do things with them. So feel free. I'm going to let Gary call on people. But like I said, feel free. It doesn't have to be a question to me. We're happy to hear. Just, just in terms of try to be, the one thing I'll say based on being at the schools, try to be respectful of time, in terms of trying to like limit I mean, I can stay here for another hour. I'm happy to, and so is Neely. But I mean, for everyone else, like try to limit your thing to, under a minute.
Matt, do you want them to write them in the chat, or do you want to take them orally?
But you could do both. You could, if you write them in the chat, that's fine with me. So, if you want to share something, that's, that's fine too.
All right. First, I guess the first person I see is Ted, and then Jerry.
Thanks very much. And thanks, Matt, for an excellent presentation. I guess my question has to do with what you said kind of towards the end.
Well, I'm sorry to cut you off, Edward. I'm sorry to cut you off. There's an echo situation. Gary, do you hear a weird echo too?
I do.
So if so if everyone could just make sure they're on mute, except for Edward and me, make sure you're on mute, because that's probably why we're getting the echo. But Edward, I can still hear you. You're just going to distract people. So go on.
I'm going to mute everybody first, and then you can unmute yourself, Ted.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, Ted, you can unmute yourself.
So I guess towards the end, you said, about Zionism and people being critical of being anti-Israel. So can't I love Israel and be a supporter of Israel, but have a nuanced take that I don't like some of their politics? Matt, you're muted.
Of course you can be. Of course you can be. I wasn't referring to those people. I was referring to the people who say Israel doesn't have any right to exist.
Okay.
I think every American Jew, wrestles with aspects of Israel. Maybe it's the rabbinate. Maybe it's the IDF. Maybe, that's of course, and loves Israel. I'm referring to people, what we mean by anti-Zionist is the Jewish state has no right to exist, period.
Okay, I just think, in a lot of places that it encompasses more than that. I think that, when I go to like lecture groups at an Orthodox temple and things like that, and like if you have any anti-Israel take, even at my own, even at Little Neck Jewish Center, sometimes like any anti-Israel take is taken the wrong way. But I think you could love and be a supporter of Israel, but still be anti some of their policies. So that's just I wanted to make sure that that's not.
Yeah, I imagine almost everyone on this call agrees with you. Whether it's the conversion issue or praying at the Western Wall or, things, military, I imagine everyone has some issues with Israel and still loves it. But again, in my slides, I'm referring to the people who deny the existence of Israel. That when people use the term anti-Zionism, it specifically means no Jewish state on any land ever, period, destroy it. Anti-Zionism does not mean I love Israel and have some issues with it.
Okay, thank you. Jerry, and then I see Gail has her hand up.
Hi, Matt. Thanks. Thanks for the great presentation. Just wanted to mention a couple of things to you. I think at the Avion conference or shortly thereafter, there were 2 countries that allowed Jews to emigrate, including the Dominican Republic. And my second question is, I don't know if you're following the Kyrie Irving nonsense, but would you want to comment on that?
Yes. Yes. Thank you for adding that. I know that a couple of countries did do right and try to admit more people. Actually, the St. Louis, the U.S. Virgin Islands was ready to take in the St. Louis passengers, but FDR's Secretary of State killed that idea. They were all about to be settled in the U.S. Virgin Islands. More to your question, yes, at every school I went to in Canada, students asked about, or I brought up the Kyrie Irving, of him sending out this documentary, Kanye West, of course. And I think it was good that we had the reaction we did to Kanye West, because we could model for students that hate speech needs to be slapped down immediately and firmly and strongly. And the lessons I was giving about the Holocaust, like I said, it was really 101 oriented about how propaganda led to the Holocaust, about how a mass movement was formed. So to bring in Kanye and Kyrie Irving, I felt it was very good for students. And I'll add another name to the mix, which is Montana Tucker. So a lot of you might know that TikTok is the platform that young people are on, period. And there's a young Jewish woman, Montana Tucker, who went to Auschwitz and filmed her family's stories and has been airing it as a docuseries on TikTok. And millions of high school students and younger, have been watching this, and they've been getting a Holocaust education from her. So I think we need to look at both sides of the coin. Of course, we should attack back with Kanye West. And of course, however, we need to be a lot more creative about how we're actually educating the millions of non-Jewish youth about the Holocaust.
Thank you, Matt.
All right. I think Gail was next, and then Naomi, and then Judith Markowitz.
Please don't ignore me. As a Holocaust survivor, I would like to speak to what Ted Goodman just said.
Oh, you can, Eva, you certainly may speak. We'll put you in the line.
Thank
For
you.
sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I won't leave. I personally won't leave. I have nothing after. I won't leave until I hear from everyone who wants to talk. So that's a personal promise.
Okay, in that order, I think it was Gail, then Stan, and then Judith, and Eva.
Hello, my question is regarding silence. Both my parents were Holocaust survivors. And I remember my father as a child telling me he was very involved in politics and in the synagogue, that when he would bring up the Holocaust, he would be politely told to shut up, basically, by his peers. And it seems like it wasn't until the second generation who had to carry their parents who were so damaged, brought it out in public in the media. I've worked with a lot of crime victims, and I always questioned when somebody's a crime victim. I work with rape victims, I work with Holocaust survivors, children of Holocaust survivors. It's almost like they're lepers. People don't want to be associated with victims. People, not everybody, but a good majority, like it's almost like you can catch it or something. And I think we're in a dilemma today with Kyrie, Irving, Kanye West. They're very well-known celebrities. I mean, a few days ago, the FBI was looking for one person in Jersey who made terrorist threats. Well, Kanye West why is he not in prison? What is it about our laws that he is protected? And if something were to happen to him, people would then blame the Jews for that.
Yeah.
It's like a no-win situation in terms of speaking up. And because I've spent my life speaking up for victims, people that don't have a voice, and people who have this big following are, I mean, to me, getting away with murder, basically, and it becomes almost a no-win situation of damned if you do, damned if you don't, because if you happen to be a victim of a violent crime, good luck in this society. You're going to be re-victimized.
Yeah.
You're going to be shamed and blamed the way so many Holocaust survivors were shamed and blamed. To this day, I kept hearing, well, they were asking for it. It was there, I mean, people are siding with the perpetrators, not the victims. And what is that about? If somebody could explain the whole silence thing, that's what silences people, because they know they're going to be blamed and shamed.
Yeah, I regularly read about how Holocaust survivors were received in Israel and the U.S. And the more I read, the more disturbing it is, because they were ignored.
Disturbing.
They were of suspect moral character for having survived. And I'll just make, I don't have too much to say about this. I don't write about it much, but I'll just mention Helen Epstein's book. If anyone wants to read about this, Helen Epstein's book, Generations After, I forget what year in the 1970s, but she really was the first person to publish a book, Epstein, on the children of survivors and all their sort of neuroses, whatever you want to call them, and how they got there. And now you have people my age where the 3Gs, calling themselves the 3Gs, they're also publishing in abundance, about 20 books a week, most of them unreadable. But Helen Epstein that book is still relevant 50 years later, about the silence and what that silence did to them, what coming back to the silence did to them for the rest of their lives and to their children.
It's generational, and I see it because I've dealt with so many victims. I've fought for people, I've represented people, and I look at a society that has become so callous today in this country in terms of everything that's going on, that everything is twisted, and there's so much gaslighting, of pointing to the victim and blaming them.
Yeah.
And it's become almost like a sickness.
I don't want this to be a dialogue. I just want to keep the questions moving along, but thank you. I think Stan was next, and then Judith, and then Eva.
I had read recently that when Hitler came to power and during the early years of his administration, he didn't know the location and how many Jews were actually in Germany, and that IBM came to his rescue, and they did, with their software and computers, studies of how many Jews there were in Germany and their location.
I'm not an expert on. Oh, my understanding is they did know where the Jews were, unfortunately, because of the sort of the congregation lists, the Jewish affiliation lists. And IBM, my understanding is they became very complicit later in the Holocaust. Edwin Black wrote IBM in the Holocaust because they made machines that helped the Germans categorize cards of victim groups and sort them. And but my understanding is that came after, because after victims were identified in the Netherlands and Germany, the Jews were they were all on lists, unfortunately, of like congregations, or even the ones who weren't visibly Jewish, like Anne Frank's family, and those lists were handed over so readily, unfortunately.
All right, thank you. Who was next? It was Judith.
There's two Judiths.
Oh, Judith Markowitz. She said
Judith Markowitz was first,
And
then
then-
Eva, then Judith
Oh,
Levy.
Judith Levy, I wanted to say.
All right, but let Judith Markowitz go first, then Levy,
Yes,
then Eva,
definitely.
then
Okay.
Eva, and then you, Judith Levy. You may join us.
Okay,
Okay.
so I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor, okay, and I'm sure it's affected me. But I just want to point out that New York State has passed a law about Holocaust education. The governor signed it into law. And I was thinking that when I was in elementary school, nobody ever spoke about the Holocaust. I mean, I'm 69 years old, but I'm saying when I went to elementary school, there was nothing written about the Holocaust in textbooks or anything like that. I also wanted to comment on Kanye and Kyrie's rants that just because they were fined, they couldn't play in games and financial retributions, I think they should go further and have them sit through Holocaust movies. I think that would be really an eye opener because they see things in the abstract. So if they're forced to sit down and watch these movies and what really happened to the Jews, I believe that
Kyrie was offered that. I'm not following it too closely, but the NBA made 6 or 7 sort of demands, and he could have said yes to a trip to Auschwitz. Trust me, he could have said yes to it and have it. He said no. People are the ADL, they offer the anti-Semites a trip to DC or Auschwitz so they can redeem their reputations, okay? So I guarantee you, and I know this Montana Tucker woman I was telling you about, she wrote online publicly to Kyrie Irving to watch her docuseries, and she got unfollowed by millions of people who suddenly were anti-Semites when they realized she's Jewish, confronting Kyrie Irving, suddenly she's getting unfollowed. So I don't mean to be cynical, but I think these people are offered the education, a lot of the time.
All right, thank you. Eva, I think you are next, then Judith Levy.
Okay, so I am a Holocaust survivor, and I take issue with what was said before about, can we not be critical of Israel? Yes, of course you can be critical, but the whole point of IHRA, and you have to know what that is. And I think that, Matt, you should speak more about the definition, how that law came into being and why it's so important. It's more people who speak against Israel, especially Jews. It's not just people who want Israel destroyed. It is also people who are engaging in propaganda against Israel that are lies. The radical Islamist agenda against the Jews, and that they are talking every day in Iran about the destruction of all Jews in the world. They want another Holocaust, and we're not dealing with that. So the propaganda on campuses includes accusations that Jews are stealing the land, that Jews lies about Jewish history and what they have a right to, and the fact that they have no, they have no basis for being in that land. Yes, that's like saying to destroy, but sometimes there's a fine line between what a lot of the young Jewish students on campus are saying about Israel, and the IHRA creates a law that says if you're doing anti-Semitic speech, being anti-Zionist, meaning all of the lies that are said about Israel, is also considered anti-Semitism. There is now a merging of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. So yes, if we say, well, I didn't like that Netanyahu was elected, that's fine. That's fine. But if we agree that the Palestinians are being thrown out of their land, no, that's not right, because that's not true. So, that it's a very fine line. And I think it would be important for the students that you speak to understand about IHRA. And yes, now it isn't okay to have an apartheid wall, because Israel is not an apartheid state. It's not okay. It's anti-Semitic. So that's what I wanted you to know.
Ava, first of all, it's an honor to have you here as a survivor. And thank you for what you just said. Every word I take to heart. And I agree with you. We are ramping up our efforts to explain that to students. And I agree with every word you said.
All right, thank you. Judith Levy, I think you're next. You're muted, so if you wish to.
Oh, I do that all the time. I start talking and I'm on mute.
No, Matt, you're not on mute, but
No,
Judith,
I know. Judith, we can't hear you.
I grew up in a Jewish family in the early 40s. My brother went immediately to war in Europe, and not in Europe, in the Pacific. And my father was very happy that he didn't go to Germany. I didn't know too much as a child, but I did know that my father would say all about anti-Semitism in this country, that the Father Conklin, or whatever his name was a very big destroyer of Jews verbally. And people who were Jewish here were not interested in showing their identity, because it wasn't really that great to be Jewish in society. And this is something, maybe there would have been more of an uprising had people not been fearful of their own identity in the United States. That's all I have to say.
No, I'll just comment on that, Judith. I agree with what you said. And I mentioned ethnic studies. One of the things we're trying to do is speak to students in the language of ethnic studies so they understand the Jews. And Father Coughlin, Charles Lindbergh, there are so many prominent examples. Some things I learned I didn't know. In a city like Boston, on the menus at restaurants, where there were stickers on every menu that Jews can't eat there. There were Nazi marches in the streets. So, American youth today, Jewish youth, let's say, in high school or college, they have no concept of the restricted housing and rocks getting thrown at you, in New York City on your way home from shul. So we believe, I mean, of course, I didn't get into it in this presentation, but we believe that's essential to combat this notion that we are somehow, Jews are somehow all white, all rich, all controlling, all powerful. So thank you for that comment.
All right, Matt, there was at least one question that I really didn't understand too well in the chat. Maybe you can look at it and answer it. And while you're doing that, I did look up that Avram Berg book on Google. It's called "The Holocaust is Over. We Must Rise from Its Ashes" by Avram Berg.
Oh, unfortunately, I didn't watch Saturday Night Live, but it's disturbing to hear, based on the comment from Sharon in the chat, it's disturbing to hear that he did in the end say Jews control Hollywood. And basically verified. Well, that's disturbing. But yeah, I haven't heard about that yet, except from here. Great. Were there any other hands up or people,
Anybody else?
let's see.
All right, it looks like everybody has spoken his piece or her piece. We really want to appreciate all your questions and comments. I want to thank our speaker, Matt, and the assist from Neely, who was, I guess, there to give a moral support. To the 4 synagogues who have co-sponsored this program, Congregation Eitz Chaim at Hiles Hills Bayside, Congregation Lador Vador, Fresh Meadows Jewish Center, and Temple Torah, and all the rabbis and the Yom HaShoah committee that made this possible. Thank you very much and have a good day. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much.
Wait a second. I see Judy Samuels has her hand up.
Oh,
So
Yes, I do. I do. Thank you. I just want to say that I absolutely agree with Eva when she's talking, when she said that it's very difficult to criticize Israel because it adds to the anti-Semitism, and Jewish people, it's one thing to criticize Israel within your own community, but being vocal about it outside of the community only helps anti-Semitism. And I think it's a terrible thing that any Jew will criticize Israel outside of their own immediate community, where it won't be taken the wrong way. And it has been taken the wrong way. And I think it's a terrible thing it's another country, and the majority of people vote there and make their decisions according to how they have to live. And it's not our business for what they decide to do, just like you don't want any other country coming in and telling us how our election should have been held in America. You don't need to criticize the elections in another country. And Israel being, and criticizing Israel makes for more anti-Semitism than we need as it is. So that's my comment.
All right, thank you. I think the action step that we all can take is whenever we confront anti-Semitism, we should not be silent. We should use all the tools that we have in our toolkit. Organizations like Stand With Us, the ADL, write letters, protest, and stand up for the Jewish people. So thank you again, Matt, for enlightening us. Thank you for all coming. Have a good day. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Very good, Judy.